Okay, beautiful. So we left off, again, talking about some background notions. We did some distinguishing between different types of arguments, said, look, we're only going to really focus on deductive arguments. We talked about the sorts of things that can go in as premises, only assertoric sentences. They need to assert stuff. It can be truth apt. And we talked about our simplifying assumptions with regards to notions of truth and falsity. We got just the two. They're exhaustive and exclusive. Every assertoric sentence is either true or false, and no assertoric sentence is both true and false. Cool. So what I'd like to do for this last little bit of section 2, covering these background notions, is introduce you to some fundamental concepts. Now, these are, unfortunately, as we first introduce them, going to be a little bit fuzzy. And one of the things our logical machinery is going to be designed to do is to formalize these, make them more specific and clearer. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. I hate that shit. So rude. Anyway, okay. So, as I say, what we want to do is, at this point, introduce some fundamental notions that our machinery is going to try and kind of firm up or crystallize in various ways. And the first two are a pair. And we could come at them by looking at sentences 1 and 2. Now, if we read 1 and 2, and we don't equivocate on the names, that is, we take Amanda and Bart to pick out the same people in both 1 and 2, then it looks like there's no way for them both to be true at the same time. 1 tells us Amanda's taller than Bart, and if you know the meaning of that, then you also know that, well, okay, Bart can't then be taller than Amanda, or vice versa. So these sentences are mutually exclusive. Or to put them in slightly harsher terms, we'll say they are jointly inconsistent. So we can say that some sentences are jointly inconsistent if and only if it's not possible for them all to be true together. On the flip side, we can have sentences that are jointly consistent. Right? We can say that some sentences are jointly consistent if and only if it's possible for them all to be true together. We've seen a bunch of jointly consistent sentences already. We've also seen some that were inconsistent. Do we remember the other ones that were inconsistent? The Mars's Moons, right? The two premises in the Mars's Moons argument, they were jointly inconsistent. And in fact, it was their joint inconsistency that guaranteed the validity. Okay. So, sentences are jointly consistent if and only if it's possible to make them all true together, jointly inconsistent if it's not possible to make them all true together. Note, one bit of fuzziness here. What's the sense of possibility? It's possible, in some sense, for me to run a 4-minute mile, but it is clearly also not possible, in another sense, for me to run a 4-minute mile. I mean, Jesus, running a mile, no. 4 minutes, 4 hours more like. So, there's a very kind of lurking issue here about hammering out the notion of possibility. But for our purposes, we can kind of leave it a little bit vague. One of the things our machinery is going to do is clarify that. But again, we've got these basic ideas. Now, to go along with joint consistency and inconsistency, we can also talk about a trio of properties that sentences can have with regards to their truth. So it looks like, when we think about it, some sentences must be true. That is, they have to be true. some sentences might be true or might be false, and others must be false. So to give you some examples, this is my old dog, Yobka. She passed away a few years ago, but I keep her in as a sort of tribute to her. Yobka was an amazing dog. She was more potato than dog. So let's take this sentence, Yobka's on the grass. This looks like a sentence, an asatoric sentence, that could be true or it could be false. It depends on how the world works out. Where's Yobka? If she's on the grass, it's true. If she's not on the grass, it's false. Cool. Either option looks like it's available. Take our second sentence. Either Yobka's fully on the grass or is not fully on the grass. Kind of trying to use fully here to block out the case where she's got like 1 foot on the pavement. So if we read fully in that sense, it looks like, well, this sentence could be true, certainly. Is there any way for this sentence to be false? Well, again, it kind of depends on how we pin down this notion of fully, right? But if we read fully as, all 4 feet are on the grass, then, well, it might be she's got 1 foot off, in which case, cool, the second part's true. Or it might be that she's got no feet on the grass, in which the second part's true. Or maybe Yobka doesn't even exist. Well, then the second part's still true. It's not the case she's fully on the grass, because she is not. Do we see that? So is there any way for this sentence to be false? It doesn't seem like it, right? It looks like basically it's either she's here or she ain't right here. And there's lots of different ways for her not to be right here. But that's fine. The sentence says either one of these two is a given. So our second sentence, again, we can kind of play with it a little bit, but we can start to see this idea that maybe this is the sentence that has to be true. No matter how the world sort of works out, our middle sentence is going to be true. Either she's all in the grass or she ain't. And then how about our third sentence? Our third sentence says, Yobka's both fully on and not fully on the grass. How does that work? The and seems to require that both are the case. But God knows how we can have it so that Yobka is exactly right here and not exactly right here at the same time in the same respect. So our third one, again, setting aside some maybe weird edge cases, looks like the kind of thing that cannot be true. It must be false. And again, we can quibble about these examples. What I'm really after here is getting you this intuitive distinction. The second one looks like it's got to be true. No matter how the world shakes out, it's going to turn out to be true. The third one looks like no matter how the world shakes out, it's going to be false. And the first one, well, you can toggle it. So let's try and pin these notions down a little bit. And let's give some definitions. We can say that a sentence is a necessary truth if and only if it's true and it's not possible for it to be false. So necessarily true means not just true, but must be. It's locked in the on position. On the other side, we can say a sentence is a necessary falsehood if and only if it's false and it's not possible for it to be true. It's locked in the off position. Our third sentence might be an example of this. 2 + 2 = 5 might be an example of this. The Pope is a married bachelor might be an example of this. Again, you can play around with it. And then our last type, we can say a sentence is contingent if and only if it's possible for it to be true and it's possible for it to be false. So again, these are just terms to help us categorize those 3 broad ways. Now, some things to stress here. These are all properties that sentences can have. These are not properties an argument can have. Validity and soundness are properties of arguments, not sentences. Truth or falsity are properties of sentences. Necessary truth, necessary falsehood, contingency are properties of sentences. Now, of course, arguments are made up of sentences, right? The sentences are premises and conclusions. So here's some things we can start to think about. What happens if we have an argument whose premise is a necessary truth? If we have an argument whose premise is a necessary truth, does that guarantee the argument's validity? Well, so that's, the other premises might be there and they might be false, but that's not really going to tell us much about validity. What's the important point about why it doesn't guarantee validity?
Because the other premises could still be true, but the conclusion is
right. The premises could, in fact, all the premises could be necessarily true, but if the conclusion's a necessary falsehood or contingency, then there's going to be a possible situation. Premises are all on, conclusion is off. That means the argument's invalid. Remember, the definition of validity, it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Okay, here's another one. What if we have an argument whose conclusion is a necessary truth? Can we say anything about that argument? The conclusion's a necessary truth. Do we know that argument's going to be valid, or know that it's going to be invalid, or do we need some more information?
valid.
Tell me why.
You said before that could be zero. So if the conclusion is valid, is true.
So not just true, right? It's got to be
True.
necessarily true, right? It has to be. Nice. Right? So again, let's talk through the reasoning here. You got it, right? So if the conclusion is necessarily true, is it possible to make all the premises true and the conclusion false? If the conclusion is necessarily true, is it possible to make premises all true and conclusion false? No, right? Because if it's necessarily true, it's locked in the on position. Ain't no way to make it false. Well, if there ain't no way to make it false, then there ain't no way to make it false and to make the premises true. It's the opposite of the case we had before. Remember the Mars's Moons case? That was valid because it was impossible to make all the premises true. Well, if you also have a conclusion that's always on, cool. Doesn't matter what the premises are. This fucker's valid. Has to be. Yeah.
What if both the premises are jointly inconsistent?
Cool. So, if we have premises that are jointly inconsistent, what's the argument? What kind of property does the argument have to have? It has to be valid, right? This is the Mars's Moons case. If the premises are jointly inconsistent, arguments guaranteed to be valid no matter what we say about the conclusion. Similarly, if the conclusion is a necessary truth, do we care about what kind of things the premises are? Nah. If the conclusion's locked to true, argument's valid. You can give me any reasons you want, because that conclusion, I should just believe it anyway. Like, this is what you were saying, right? Here's the fun limit case. Conclusion's a necessary truth. I give you no premises. You should believe this because it's got to be true. Again, we're going to talk more about these. This is just sort of playing around with these interrelations, right? So don't worry if it's not quite clicking yet. What we want to do is just start thinking about these, understanding the definitions, and start to interplay them. Okay, so, and these are all still pretty vague because, well, cool, again, we should ask about what's the relevant sense of possibility here. All right. So what we've done so far is, again, I've given you a kind of description of what formal logic is. I gave you my sales pitch, and we talked about some of the kind of assumptions we're going to run with and some background distinctions. The last little bit that I want to do here is to get us starting in on our first formal language, truth functional logic. And in order to do that, we're going to start thinking about this first steps in formalization. So that's what we're going to do for the last 20 minutes here. So here's another argument. Again, talking about Yabka. Premise 1, Yabka's asleep. Premise 2, if Yabka's asleep, then she's snoring. Conclusion, Yabka is snoring. So first question, valid, invalid? What do you think, valid, invalid? It's valid. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be as well. Okay, cool. Valid argument. Nice. Next argument. Premise 1, Yabka's awake. Oh God, she's awake. Premise 2, if Yabka's awake, then she's hungry. Conclusion, Yabka's hungry. Valid, invalid? It's valid. Look familiar. There's something kind of similar between the argument I gave you one slide ago and this one, right? They have the same basic structure. Do we see it? So I'm going to go back a slide here, right? There's this one. And then here's the, oh God, she's awake one. Same structure. Same structure. What is the structure? Well, something like this. Premise 1 is blah, blah. Premise 2 is if blah, blah, then blue, blue. And the conclusion is blue, blue. And now the noises are kind of fun, but they're going to get annoying to keep repeating. Right? But if you can see what we're doing here, you've already got the first move for symbolizations. What we're going to try and do is replace natural language sentences, sentences of English in this case, with some kind of markers that let us track positions. And we're going to be sure that we keep the same markers for the same replacements. That's really all TFL is going to be. It's giving us a tool to do something like this. So let's keep going, right? Here's our underlying structure. But again, the blah blahs and the blue blues, while funny, are a little bit annoying after a while. So let's just replace them with capital letters. So we can say these both have the same basic structure of A, if A then B, therefore B. Each letter in this case represents something like a spot for, or in this case, a particular complete English sentence. Simple English sentence. Right? Yabka's awake, Yabka's snoring. Or sorry, Yabka's awake, Yabka wants to eat. Yabka's asleep, Yabka's snoring. Nathan's fat, Nathan should lose weight. Right? We can plug these in for A's and B's, and as long as we're consistent, the argument's always going to be valid. Doesn't matter what we plug in for A and what we plug in for B. Everybody see that? Cool. You've already got the basic idea for TFL. Trick's now just going to be doing the rest. No matter what we plug in for the A's and B's, argument's guaranteed to be valid. And that's just simply because of the structure. So this argumentative structure is very useful. Because if we can show that any particular natural language argument can be mapped onto this structure, we're done. We know the argument is good, at least with regards to this form. We might have some work to do to see if the A's and B's are true, but that's a matter for somebody else. I don't want to get out of my armchair. So to assess the validity of arguments, one way forward is to think about various argumentative structures, see if natural language arguments can be re-expressed in structures we know are good. You see the sort of basic project here? It's going to be taking English arguments, re-expressing them in this sort of simplified structure, and then seeing, is this a good or bad structure? If it is, argument's valid. We don't even care what the English sentences were. That's going to be our first tool. That's going to be TFL. So the next 3 weeks is going to be talking about how to do this sort of re-expression process and then evaluate whether the structure is a good one or a bad one. This is our sledgehammer tool. It's very effective. Limited in some ways, but by God, is it really useful. So here's one particular kind of argumentation structure. It's not the only one. There are plenty of other good ones. Don't feel like you have to memorize these, but I just want you to maybe see them. I think Michael is going to talk to you a little bit about some of these in particular. But here's our first one on the left, right? Suppose I give you this structure. A or B, not A. A or B, not A, therefore B. He went down the alleyway or up the stairs. The alleyway is blocked with a big garbage bin. He must have gone up the stairs. Here's another one. This is our middle one. I know it's not the case that both A and B, but I also know A. Well, so must be the case that not B. I know that Nathan isn't tall and handsome. I know he's handsome, therefore he must not be tall. Again, jokes, but I hope you can see it. And our last one, an interesting one. So we have if A then B, not B, therefore not A. Note the structure here. Note the structure. We have if A then B, and our second premise tells us that the second part is false. And it concludes that the first part must be false too. To put it in terms of Yobka, right? If I know that Yobka's not hungry, then I conclude that she must not be awake. Because remember earlier I said, if she's awake, she is hungry. The interesting thing about these are all good argumentative structures. If we can map them, we know it's valid. Yes?
But isn't it like denying the antecedent?
Good. So denying the antecedent is the other way around. Here is a bad argument structure. We'll talk more about this in the tutorial, but here's a bad one. If A then B, not A, therefore not B. That's a different one. Right? That's the bad one. Right? But that's a different structure than what we have here. This structure, the last one on the right, it tells us if the second part's false, then the first part must be false too. And we'll talk more about these in the tutorials. We're going to go through some of these. Again, if we can map English arguments into these, then we know that they're guaranteed to be valid. The structure alone does the job, regardless of what the sentences involved say. Now, a quick caveat. This isn't going to be the only way to guarantee validity. There will be some arguments that are going to turn out to be valid, not because of their argumentative form. Here's a cheap one. Premise 1, the Pope is a bachelor. Conclusion, the Pope is male. This is a valid argument. Now, it's not valid in virtue of its form, because its form is just A, therefore B, which is a very bad form. This one's valid because of the meaning of the terms involved. if you know what it means to be a bachelor, to be an unmarried male of a relevant age, then you know that if the Pope is a bachelor, he must be a male. It's just part of the concept there. Now, these are the sorts of arguments that are valid in virtue of meaning, TFL is not going to be able to capture. This is why it is a sledgehammer. It doesn't care about content. It cares about structure. Put another way, it doesn't care what the sentences are, it just cares how you built them. So we're going to put these aside for now. We're going to come back to look at sentences like this in our second formal language, which will start to give us ways to capture notions of meaning. So this highlights an important limitation of TFL. It only helps us understand arguments valid in virtue of forms, not in virtue of, say, meaning, which is fine. Again, if we're interested in validity, it's a good place to start. So our first formal language is truth functional logic, TFL. It's often called propositional or sentential logic. People might have come across this before. Have people done like Boolean algebra? People seen that before or heard it? If you've used search engines, you know how to use Boolean algebra. If you've ever used the like and or an if-then statement in your search, you are doing something that is basically TFL. So how are we going to use TFL? What we're going to do is we're going to take natural language sentences, English, and then re-express them in our highly restrictive language of TFL, and use this to assess things like validity, soundness occasionally, not really, but occasionally. And we're going to develop surrogates for the notions of joint inconsistency, joint consistency, necessary truth, necessary falsehood, and contingency. We're going to re-express formalized versions of those slightly vague concepts. So how do we start with TFL? The fundamental building block of truth functional logic are atomic sentences. They are atomic in the old Democritan sense. They are simple. They are partless. The best way to think about them is they are the one-by-one bit of Lego. There's no smaller part that makes it up, but everything is going to be built out of these little one-by-one Legos stuck together. They are the basic building blocks out of which all other more complicated sentences are going to be built. They can stand alone. You can have a very boring little bit of Lego. Or we can use various tools that we're going to introduce next lecture to build bigger, more complex structures. So, atomic sentences. These are our building blocks. How do we use them? Well, we are going to map natural language sentences onto them. We did it already. Remember when we made the little jokey thing about blah blahs and blue blues? That was it. That was the same process. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Put your hand up, so I thought. So when we symbolize English into TFL, we're going to replace all atomic English sentences like Yalka's hungry, Yalka's asleep, Nathan's fat, with capitalized letters, uppercase letters. These letters symbolize the relevant English sentences. Now I stress symbolize here because they do not mean the English sentences. These letters mean nothing. They are mere symbols. They have no meaning, just like me. They are mere symbols, tools that we can use to manipulate. They are points where we can hang a truth value, a circuit that we can run a 1 or 0 through. That's it. So we can symbolize, for example, Nathan is hungry as H. Lincoln was shot as S. And we can use these to start to build more complex ones. So either Yobk is awake or she's snoring, we can symbolize this or A or N. Again, it doesn't really matter what letters we plug in. Okay. Basic idea clear? Okay. If needed, we can add subscripts. In the rare case that we need to have more than 26 different atomic sentences, I'm never going to ask you that because that'll be a nightmare for everyone involved. But we have this option in case we need it. Right? So this means that we have an infinite number of possible atoms that we can use. Okay. So of course, when we make our mappings, we need guides for how to do the mapping, how the symbolization works. So we have a symbolization key. As the name suggests, a symbolization key specifies the mapping. It's a function. It says, hey, here are the English atomic sentences, and here are the relevant TFL letters that symbolize it. So my little table here gives you a symbolization key. A stands for Yobk is awake, B is for Yobk is snoring, C, Nathan is hungry. Let me stress again, this isn't to say that capital A means Yobk is awake. Capital A means nothing at all. It has no meaning. Just what it symbolizes. It's what it's standing for. Meaning does not come up in TFL. Again, fairly clear. This is a sort of similar things that if you've done a lot of algebra before, or even some geometry, you will have come across something along these sorts of lines. So we can do a quick run through, right? Here's our symbolization key. Using this key, how would we symbolize our first sentence? Yeah, easy. Bingo, bango, right? Easy peasy. How about our second one? If Lincoln was shot, then he died. Right? So we'll say if B, then C, just to kind of keep the structure. Everybody seeing it? We getting it? We getting it? Yobk is awake or she's snoring. Yep. D or E. Nathan's hungry and Yobk is snoring. Yeah. A and E. Right? Again, not a super duper mind bending exercise here, just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. Right? The key tells you which letter to use in place of the English. Now, to spoil what we're going to do next week, right, note in these symbolizations, we're keeping the kind of English for if then, for or, and for and. The true power of TFL comes in when we start to replace these with symbols, because the symbols turn out to just be functions. More on that again next week. But the place to start, what we have to do to start TFL is this mapping. We take English atomic sentences, simple English acitoric sentences. We map them to capital letters, which may or may not have little numbers on them, just to help keep track. And this gives us the first move in simplifying, abstracting away so we can start thinking about the form that these arguments have. Cool? Beautiful. Okay. We're getting this, we're doing well. So the big advantage of symbolizing English in this way is that it makes it much easier to assess the form of a given sentence or of an argument using that sentence. It strips away noise. English is messy. TFL is not. The big disadvantage is that English is messy and TFL is not. If there's any internal structure to an English atomic sentence, it goes away as soon as we represent it with this partless atom. If we replace the very complex structure with my one-by-one Lego, then we lose all the complexity that was inside. One thing to really drive this home is note that TFL has no words. Right? Because what is the basic building block of TFL? It's a sentence. It's an atomic sentence. There are no substantial parts. There's no names. There's no verbs. There's just fucking capital letters, man. That's it. This is why we can't capture meaning. Because meaning is going to be expressed by combinations of those substantial parts. But this is really useful for us because, again, it abstracts away from a bunch of noise. If we're interested in forms of arguments, substantial parts can get in the way. So, there we go. This is the beginnings of TFL. It's going to be this mapping from English sentences to these capital letters. Those are our base units. Beautiful. So, that's good. Again, to wrap up what we did, started off by telling you about what formal logic is, my little sales pitch for it. We did a whole bunch of kind of ground clearing. Along the way, I introduced you to our big, beautiful notion of validity. And then we started in on this basic symbolization, the general idea behind TFL. What we're going to do next week is we are basically going to learn the rest of TFL. Super cool. This is the quickest you'll ever learn a foreign language in your life. Next week is going to be grammar and syntax. Yay! Who doesn't love that? I'm going to teach you about the connectives. These are the tools that let us build more complex sentences out of the atoms. And then I'm going to give you a true definition of what a TFL sentence is. It looks like a nightmare, but it's basically just a way for us to make explicit the grammar of this language. So, ask you to read these bits from the textbook. In the tutorial, we will talk through all of these questions. There'll be space for any other questions you have. So yeah, thank you guys for coming. Have a lovely rest of the week, and hopefully see you all in tutorial. I don't do that.